Welcome, a very warm welcome on behalf of the University of Oregon to all of you guys. I wanted to thank you for being here and remind you that this event is part of a series of events that is being hosted by the University of Oregon. And if you'd like more information about upcoming events, please go to the UO Alumni Association website, which is at uoalumni.com. Now, if you could please go ahead and mute your audio and turn off your cameras. That will be less distracting for the speakers. However, if you would like to participate in the conversation, we strongly encourage you to do so over the chat feature. So we will be addressing questions and comments in the last, say, 15 minutes or so of the presentation. And also a recording of this will be available on the Alumni Association YouTube channel in a couple of days. So I'd like to introduce our esteemed panel. Let me switch the slide here. And is it going to do it for me? It worked in rehearsal, there we go. Greg Dotson is a law school alum from the class of '95. He's also an expert in energy and environmental law, especially as they relate to climate change. At the University of Oregon, he's an assistant professor of law and a faculty member at the Environmental and Natural Resource Law Center. There, he leads the Energy Law and Policy Project. Latisha Nixon Jones is a visiting professor and an expert in disaster law. At Southern Oregon University Law Center in Louisiana, she was responsible for establishing a disaster law clinic. The clinic's focus was helping low-income individuals with civil legal issues in the aftermath of natural and man-made disasters. She recently wrote an article called Coronavirus Quarantines and Your Legal Rights, 4 Questions Answered, which was published in several mainstream outlets, including Business Insider. Liz Tippett specializes in employment law, and her research includes such topics as the Me Too movement and how employee timekeeping software can erode compliance with labor laws. She recently wrote an article called New Federal Sick Leave Law, Who's Eligible, Who's Not, and How Many Weeks Do You Get? And it was published in The Conversation. Thank you to all of you for being here and welcome. I am going to stop my screen share so that Greg, you can go ahead and take over.
Thank you so much. Well, thanks for the opportunity to talk a bit about COVID-19 and climate change. I'm going to try to cover a lot of ground in the next 15 minutes. This first slide might be completely unnecessary. COVID-19, of course, is the illness that one gets from the novel coronavirus that is now sweeping across the globe. According to the CDC, there are about 1.2 million cases of COVID-19 and more than 70,000 Americans have tragically died from the disease. Climate change, on the other hand, arises from the situation where humans have added greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, and the planet on average is getting warmer. This is resulting in alterations to historic climate patterns, sea level rise, more extreme weather events, drought, and more intense wildfires. So I think the point here is that climate change is not caused by the coronavirus, and the coronavirus is not caused by climate change. And yet still we see cartoons like this one from The Economist. You see the planet is duking it out with the coronavirus. The coronavirus is labeled the preliminary round with an imposing climate change waiting to go next. So obviously the cartoonist is trying to convey that climate change is an even bigger challenge than COVID-19, but why talk about them together? And there's 3 reasons that I can think of. The solutions to both challenges may have similar characteristics. They're global challenges, they require international cooperation as well as teamwork or collective action within nations. Individuals and communities have to work together, change the way they do some things in order to address both of these crises. Second, the US and the world are having a pretty intense, we're having a pretty intense political conversation about climate change just a few months ago. And that conversation has been sidelined by the pandemic. And you just think about it, you remember the wildfires in Australia, which seems like forever. And third, how we respond to the coronavirus could very well affect how well we are able to respond to climate change. So to explore some of this in the next few minutes, I'm going to discuss some areas where the pandemic and climate change are making things harder when they interact, some areas that people see as encouraging, and I'm going to try to explore how the pandemic might affect our longer-term efforts to address climate change. So let's start with some immediate challenges where the two crises may interact. Scientists inform us that hurricanes have been increasing in intensity due to climate change. So as we approach hurricane season on June 1, how do hurricanes and the coronavirus interact? Well, in Florida, we see a concern that the pandemic could lead to a compound disaster. Concerns over whether FEMA will be ready for hurricane season this year, concerns over sheltering people. If evacuation orders are given, will people remove themselves to shelter remotely with strangers? Obviously, this could be particularly challenging for vulnerable communities like nursing homes. Closer to home, we know that the warmer, drier periods that we're experiencing with climate change can lead to worse wildfires, and coronavirus could significantly challenge how these fires are fought. In addition to concerns that there may be diminished federal resources to fight fires, more fundamentally, there's concern that the way fires are fought with wildlands firefighters working in close proximity for extended periods is exactly the opposite of what's being called for in response to the pandemic. And in this photo, you'll see that the firefighters are inmates. So this is in itself is significant, because what we're seeing reported across the country is that it's very difficult to control the coronavirus in prison populations. Prisons are a hotspot for COVID-19 infection, yet they are an important part of our fire response. In 2019, about 3,700 inmates helped fight wildfires in California. So turning to the more immediate effects, about 4.2 billion people, so more than 1/2 of the global population, were subject to complete or partial lockdowns as of the 28th of April. And this represents almost 60% of the global GDP, and nearly all of the global population is affected by some form of containment measures. We all know in a firsthand way what this means. We're not commuting, commercial and industrial facilities are closed. Instead of business or vacation travel, we're all getting comfortable with Zoom. So we need less gasoline for our cars, less electricity and natural gas for our businesses, and much less jet fuel for our airplanes. So that's my quote on the slide here. It says from the International Energy Agency, with travel, trade, and mobility restricted by various lockdown measures, demand for fossil fuels is falling across the board for coal, oil, and natural gas. They estimate that for Q1 of 2020, coal demand globally dropped by 8%, oil demand dropped by 5%, gas demand dropped by 3%. And the world is discovering in a very real way that when we don't burn fossil fuels, the air is actually much cleaner. So in London, we're seeing the lowest pollution since 2000, at least. In Los Angeles, it was reported on April 6th that Los Angeles had the lowest pollution of any city in the world. And this is amazing for a city that has been historically very challenged by air pollution. In India, many people have seen on social media that the pandemic is revealing that there are towns that have views of the Himalayas that had not been seen for quite some time. And in Washington, D.C., we see headlines like this, the cleanest spring air in 25 years. And of course, the pandemic response is also reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So the U.S. Energy Information Administration estimates that U.S. carbon pollution will drop by 7.5% in 2020, and the International Energy Agency estimates the global pollution will drop by 8%. So those are big drops. But when you put it in the context of what's needed to address climate change, you see that a one-year drop is perhaps not as meaningful as you thought it might be. So here's a chart that's put together by the world's leading scientists that examines different emission reduction pathways to cut pollution to prevent more than 1.5 degrees of warming. And each of these blue lines and the gray lines is a different scenario that they examine that would avoid the worst effects of climate change. And pretty much you can see that what the chart shows is that all the scenarios pretty much require getting to net zero emissions by mid-century. So that's a lot of pollution reduction in a very short amount of time. So I'll put some red dots up here to show you what we now can expect to happen between 2019 and 2020. So that's an 8% drop. And so that basically takes us from 38 gigatons of carbon dioxide in 2019 to just under 35 gigatons in 2020. No question, that is directionally helpful to climate change, but 1 year is not enough. As you think about extrapolating that to meet these curves, we need reductions like this year after year. And it should probably go without saying, but I'll say it anyway, this is a terrible way to get emissions reductions. The pain and suffering of the pandemic, loss of life, along with the economic harm our communities are suffering, this would not be a way that anyone would want to achieve emissions reductions. So the question is, will these emissions reductions last? And can we achieve the needed additional emissions reductions in a way that's, of course, less painful as well? The conventional wisdom is that once economic activity returns, pollution will return unabated. And to support this view, people often point to what happened after the 2008-2009 economic downturn. So this is a chart of global greenhouse gas emissions from the year 1990 to 2009. And as you can see, greenhouse gas emissions from the energy sector took a substantial dip in 2008 and 2009. But let's see what happened out to 2016 when the global economy rebounded. Emissions returned. And so is that a foregone conclusion that that's what will happen after the pandemic? I don't think so. All you have to do is look to the United States during the same time. So each of these bars represents the level of annual greenhouse gas emissions in the United States from 1990 to 2009. And again, as you can see, US emissions tumbled in 2008 and 2009. So what happened when the economy rebounded? Pollution levels never returned to 2007 levels, and 2007 has been the peak ever since. So why did this happen? There's a few reasons, but a major one was that the US decided in 2009 to recover from the economic downturn in part by investing heavily in renewable energy, energy efficiency, and other clean energy. People needed jobs. The government was going to spend money to create those jobs, and it did it in a way that promoted the energy sectors of the future. EPA began regulating carbon emissions from cars and trucks, and that combination of regulation and investment, along with, I should add, new natural gas resources that were being brought to market, offered at fire sale prices, and those also helped reduce coal consumption. But I'll move on that later. There's our peak. So what happens now? Will emissions return to increasing levels as they did globally after the 2008 downturn? Or will we see flat or even declining emissions in the US experienced after 2008? And it really depends, in part on how Congress responds to the economic challenge of the pandemic. Although some in Congress have called for policies to boost clean energy while boosting the economy, so far these proposals haven't been supported by the White House, and none of the ideas have made it across the finish line. But let's look quickly at both the coal sector and the oil sector, because they're the biggest source of emissions in the country, and checking out their market situations might provide some hints about what to expect. This chart shows the amount of electricity generated from coal compared to the amount of electricity generated from renewable sources of electricity. The chart covers the time period from 2001 through 2019, and you can see how the lines show fluctuating demand for electricity throughout the year as demands for heating and cooling vary. So the red line shows electricity generated from coal, and over time you can see that it has steadily declined, while electricity generation from renewables in green has slowly inched up to coal. And this reflects renewable energy becoming increasingly cost competitive with coal, as well as the effect of state and federal policies to promote renewable energy. So for the first time in history, in 2019, we saw a few periods of time where we were getting more electricity as a country from renewable energy than we were getting from coal. That's something that would have been unthinkable, 15 or 20 years ago, I would say. The pandemic has accelerated this. So renewable energy sources have generated more electricity than coal every day, every single day during the month of April. And it's been happening now for like 40 consecutive days. So coal has been reduced to about 15% of the electricity generation in recent days. And again, not something that anyone expected. This chart is a chart of the nation's coal consumption since 1949. And you'll see the coal consumption peaked around 2007 and it's been declining ever since. This dot shows where we are projected to be in 2020. Coal consumption is expected to drop by 20%. And 2020 coal consumption has not, coal consumption has not been at this level since about 1965. Meanwhile, renewable energy is projected to grow in 2020 by 11%. This is significantly lower growth than was expected prior to the pandemic, but it does continue. It shows that renewable energy is continuing to growing even under the current projections. And with the right policies, of course, it could be creating jobs and growing even more. Okay, so turning to oil. Prior to 2020, oil and gas producers were having an extremely challenging situation as well. Hydraulic fracturing companies have been losing money for a decade. In 2017, the Wall Street Journal reported that they lost more than $280 billion. Reportedly, some companies had apparently been spending $2 for every $1 in revenue. And the rationale for this was that they needed to gain market share so that when oil prices went up, they would be able to capitalize on that market share and recoup all of their losses. Well, that hasn't happened in time. Accordingly, there have been more than 200 bankruptcies in the oil and gas sector since 2015, with 42 oil company bankruptcies in 2019. The pandemic has just added to these challenges. So here's a chart of oil futures prices for the last 2 years. And you look at what happened. So on January 23rd, the quarantine in the Wuhan province of China went into effect. And then on March 11th, in an event completely unrelated to the pandemic, Saudi Arabia and Russia took action they announced a massive boost in oil production. And then a week later, California announced its shelter-in-place order, and followed by other states, and you can see the prices cratered as demand cratered. In fact, it was a crashing demand along with surging supply, and it just really has hurt U.S. oil producers. It's even led to the unprecedented situation that you can see on this chart of negative oil pricing at the end of April, where contract holders were willing to pay others to take delivery of oil. They were saying, not only will I not charge you for the oil, I will actually pay you to take it off of my hands. And the U.S. will revert back to being a net importer of oil, and the industry is set to lose $1 trillion in revenues this year. So this is very grim news, and we should be expecting more bankruptcies in the oil sector. And on top of that, we have news from the CEO of Royal Dutch Shell, who's raising the possibility perhaps demand may never recover. He says, I think a crisis like this has the potential to capitalize society in a different way of thinking, much as the Paris Agreement has had. So the question is, what part of this change is durable? With energy markets, as you might have gathered from my presentation, I'm actually optimistic that we will see energy trends accelerated towards clean energy because of the challenges that these sectors were facing beforehand for reasons unrelated to the pandemic. There's questions about the societal practice. Are we going to want to return to business travel? Or is telecommuting and Zooms, are they going to become more and more prevalent? Political engagement, will people appreciate expertise and competent government after this effort? And then finally, a popular outlook. Will there be a willingness for collective action? Will people say these concerns are serious enough that we are willing to change our lives? So I think the key question here is ultimately, how do we respond? In 2009, we responded by digging out of our economic hole by promoting climate-friendly technology. And that's created a lot of cost-effective options for additional emission reductions today. It would be easy to see the country now capitalizing on those investments to both create jobs and cut pollution. And whether we do or not is something that we will all not only see, but be a participant in helping to determine. So I'll wrap up my presentation there, and now I'm happy to introduce Professor Latisha Nixon Jones.
Okay, I'm happy to be here today, and I'm going to be talking to you about creating legal first responders. And we're not necessarily talking in reference to lawyers, but being able to advocate for vulnerable populations throughout the disaster cycle. So a small agenda, we're going to talk about the history of the clinic that I created for disaster law. We're also going to talk about the call of the client, answering the call for help that's going to come from the community, and then how do we forward this call on to be able to advocate for vulnerable populations as we begin to ease restrictions back into society. So what we know is that in 1979, FEMA was created to consolidate and handle the management of disasters. And from 1979 up until 2005, we really did not have any major disasters that challenged FEMA's ability to be able to respond. However, during Hurricane Katrina, we had an historic failure in response, both on a federal level and on a state level. And so it caused us to be able to evaluate how do we respond to disasters or emergencies in an efficient and effective manner. And we are seeing this, even though we thought after 2005 we had kind of moved forward with this, we are seeing sort of this challenge now between who's responsible for responding? Is it a state level or is it a federal level in regards to providing resources, command, control? And in 2016, Louisiana in particular, after almost a year to date, 10 years out from Hurricane Katrina, received 83% of its parishes flooding. And so we began to look at how do we respond to these disasters. And I like to tell people that disasters are almost like hieroglyphics. So everything that we learn, we create all of this research, and then after the disaster or the emergency abates, we are left having to repeat this every single cycle. And so we're not really mitigating those emergencies or disasters as we move forward. And we saw this very briefly in 2017, where we had the largest year of natural disasters. In addition to Hurricanes Irma and Maria, we also had the West Coast wildfires, and it created over $150 billion in damage. And we know now that in 2020, the COVID disaster will not have the necessarily physical damage that we saw in 2017. However, we will have a much larger economic crisis on our hands. And so we begin to evaluate, given the current situations, how are we going to respond to this call from our clients? So when most people answer what do they do as an attorney and they say, oh, I practice criminal law or practice family law, the general population has some sort of grasp of what that law is. However, whenever we say I practice disaster law, the first question that I met with is, well, what is disaster law? And so we like to tell people that disaster law is the intersection of your civil law and criminal law at the intersection of the beginning, during, and aftermath of an emergency and a disaster. And so for natural disaster law, the areas of our civil code that are affected the most include our insurance law, housing law, contractor law, public benefits law. You'll know them by disaster food stamps, disaster unemployment. And then we are also looking at foreclosure and bankruptcy. It's also important to understand that the disaster law cycle happens in 4 stages, and we are always in a spectrum of that cycle. And so it is either preparedness, it is response, it's recovery, and it's mitigation. And so it's important as we go forward that right now we are realizing the effects of the preparedness, which is actually what are you doing to prepare your resources and management before the actual risk materializes. Your response is the actions that are taken once the risk materializes, and then as the risk abates, that is what you have in recovery, and what you learn from those risks going forward is your mitigation strategy. And so I want to call to attention 5 particular acts that we have seen that are playing out both in natural disasters and what we are seeing play out with the COVID crisis. And we see that the first one that we know about is the Stafford Act. And so the Stafford Act is what actually gave FEMA its the program and its processes. It defines what's a disaster, it defines what's emergency, and it defines those particular areas within a presidentially declared emergency. So whether or not you have nonprofits, whether or not it's state, whether or not it's tribal, it gives effect and defines those particular areas in response to each emergency and disaster. What we saw in 2011 under President Obama was this new shift in focus to being prepared. So beforehand, the emergency and disaster law focused majority on our response and the recovery. And we realized that in order to sort of create these ancillary effects of being able to recover, we needed to be prepared. And we're seeing a lot of this with the talks in COVID of not having any stockpiles, not having any type of congressional committees that were ready to respond once we became aware. There's also a national preparedness goal, and it defines the core capabilities that are necessary to prepare for the specific type of incidents. And those are the ones that pose the greatest threat to the nation. They include and emphasize all calls to the nation's preparedness approaches, bioterrorism, cyber terrorism. And so we realize that in just going from the normal preparedness of being able to respond, we also needed to have goals for preparedness set so that we on a federal and state level were able to reach out to those goals. Additionally, we had the Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act. As I stated beforehand, we saw an absolute failure being able to create a singular source of command. And so after Hurricane Katrina, FEMA recognized this and decided to coordinate with the Homeland Security Act in order to create this risk-based comprehensive emergency management system. And in that system is where we got this circular notion that we needed to have both preparedness, protection, mitigation, response, and recovery to both emergencies and disasters. And then in 2018, we had the Disaster Recovery Reform Act, and it was one of the largest reforms that we've seen to the Stafford Act. And it did 2 very important things that we will see play out for COVID. It gave grants to state and tribal governments and allowed them to directly administer both temporary and permanent housing. It also allowed states and governments to implement cost-effective housing solutions that they could then be reimbursed for under certain conditions. So prior to this act, in order for a state or a tribal area to receive funding, they had to submit a plan. That plan had to be approved. Then they came back and then they created the steps for that plan. Now they can create the steps, and if it's cost effective and within the state's resources, they can enact that plan and then seek congressional reimbursement. So as I stated, in 2016, in response to the severe flooding that we saw in Louisiana, we created a disaster law clinic at Southern University Law Center. This was not the first time that a disaster clinic had actually been created. One was created by Southern University and another at Loyola University after Hurricane Katrina. However, as I stated, after you go through the recovery phase, it's generally not an area of law that we have seen in the past be sustainable to maintain constant continuation within a law program. And so what we did was open the clinic, and we anticipated between 60 to 70 individuals being at the door. We also created a holistic approach to disasters, meaning that we understood that if they had legal issues, they would also probably have housing issues. They would also probably have medical issues. And so we worked with other charities and other organizations to be able to create this holistic approach. And so as I drive up to the law center, I call the other professor and I say, "Is there another event on campus?" And she said, "No, why?" And I said, "Because there are literally people wrapped around our entire building." And so when we opened the doors, we had about 250 people for that very first event. And so we understood at that point that the response was going to be more than the capacity that we had to serve those individuals. But we were able to get all of the information and create a funnel that we'll see on the next slide. But what we learned about that client is that many of them were low income. And within that low income population, we had a large elderly population, those that qualified at 65 years or older. We also saw that we had a lot of veterans with needs. We had a need with people of color, and we also had a lot of needs from single parents. Within that sector, we also realized that there were educational barriers. So we had a lot of individuals who were enacting with the law that didn't have education beyond a high school diploma. And so many of the liens that they were signing, many of the agreements they were coming into contact with, they didn't understand some of the legal language that was presented to them. And so they were giving away rights or signing or contracting themselves to information that they didn't clearly understand. We also realized that there was a bridge between those owners who were renters and then those who were homeowners. And so we quickly began to realize that we needed to create a triage in order to be able to sustain and meet the clients as a whole. One of the things that we noticed when dealing with the natural disaster and what we are seeing with COVID is that when you have the call of the client, there is this need to create a number. And so we've seen this with the 65,000 deaths. We've seen this with the 1 million confirmed cases of COVID. But behind those numbers are actual people and what they represent. And it's very important for us that we look behind the numbers and determine who exactly are those vulnerable populations. We've seen in Mississippi where the African American and the brown communities are at less than 40% of the actual population, but they account for 57% of the deaths. And so we need to know why exactly, or what are the data points and the touch points that are contributing to this high ratio. And for those of us who have been in environmental justice, we know that what we've seen is that individuals who live in low air quality will definitely be impacted by a respiratory disease. And so we need to look not only at the numbers, but what do they consist of? Where do they live? Where do they shop? And so that was important for us to determine as we were looking at the client, to not only look at them as numbers, but to actually see what those numbers represented for the vulnerable populations. And then our response. So we realized that in order to be able to effectively help those individuals, we had to do like the medical staff and triage their needs. So we had individuals who had a day-to-day need, and those were the most important people. So they may have been unhoused, they may have been in a dangerous domestic violence situation, they had safety concerns that could not be put off. We also had those individuals who may have been in their own homes, so they still had safety, they still had employment, but then they needed home repairs or they had been ripped off by a contractor. And then lastly, we had those individuals that needed assistance with their, that came about as a part of natural disaster. So if they were incorrectly terminated, if they had landlord-tenant disputes. And so we were able to create this triage that allowed us to create further partnerships to be able to address them holistically. And so in order for us to do that, we had to see who are the players in our community? And we realized very quickly that the ABA Young Lawyers Division responds to emergencies. They're doing the same thing with COVID, and they'll be able to produce information and push out disaster information. We realized that local charities, including Catholic Charities, Habitat for Humanities, and St. Vincent de Paul, are major players within the disaster and emergency spectrum. We also realized that churches were important because they were able to give us credibility and not just someone arriving in their community trying to save them, but actually people who were going to be there for the long run. We also relied on legal aid, but what we quickly realized, and we're also going to see this with COVID, is that the legal capacity or the capacity for legal aid is going to be quickly overwhelmed, especially because many of the laws are kind of paused right now. So we have this moratorium on evictions. We are seeing this infusion of funding into disaster unemployment. And so what that is doing is creating this stall wall that prevents the natural progression of things to happen. And so it's kind of like the tsunami that builds off the coast. We know it's there, we see it's coming, we just don't know when it's going to reside and then how large the waves are going to be. And then we realized that other law schools were also important because their communities were also impacted, and then they could provide resources that were outside of the scope of what we were actually trying to prepare. And so the schools that are listed here are schools that have been invested with the disaster law program. So we started at Southern University Law School. I was actually involved with creating a program at Stetson University, and the University of Oregon has been very instrumental in creating a doctrinal approach, which will allow us to provide practice-ready students and students that have these soft skills that can go into the community and be able to not just give them free legal education or services, but also give them free education. And what we've realized is that if you can connect with one, it becomes 1 to 3, because that one person that you give the education to will refer you to at least 3 of their other individuals. And so by having these law students in the community, it invests them in their career and in their community. Lastly, we're looking at sort of what the work will be. And so what we are noticing is that we're going to have to do a lot of small business resiliency planning, how to bring small businesses out from under the shelter in place, how to do so successfully, what rules and laws will be impacted, how do employees and employers come to common ground in order to move forward. What we see for a natural disaster is a lot of FEMA appeals, insurance claims, landlord tenants, foreclosure, bankruptcy, and public benefits. With the exception of FEMA, unless they extend past their public benefits, we won't sort of see that, but we will see the rest of the other 3. So we're about to see a lot of individuals that are working with their mortgages in order to either get a forbearance or in order to renegotiate their mortgage. We're going to see several landlord-tenant disputes. There's no doubt about that. We're also going to see some public benefits issues because we know that some of the public benefits were not able to cut off some of their services. And so whenever that moratorium is lifted, we're going to have members of our community with large bills that will need to navigate how do they pay for that when they're currently unemployed. We're going to also have to do a lot of community outreach. So educating the community on what they need to do, what their roles are, and what their rights are. And when you have sort of this educated community, then they are able to advocate for themselves. And so you have less litigation because there is a mediation and the ability to advocate for their rights. And then lastly is funding. So we know that if you're looking, or if you're a nonprofit organization, there are going to be grants that are going to come out. Universities are able to help their students. There are partnerships that are going to be in place, whether they're public-public, such as university-university, public-private, such as a public university that partners with the private business, or community public, which is the university working with the church. And then private donors are also going to set up to be able to help in this time of need. And then going forward, what we want to know is that you can be a part of this legal responders also. There are CERT teams that allow you to become a community emergency response person. Going forward, You would need to advocate for emergency managers. We need to create undergraduate programs that can feed into lawyers. And then we need to look at growing our clinical law programs and our doctrinal programs to respond to both disasters and local emergencies. So if you have any other questions, we can be able to address that. However, right now, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Liz Tippett.
Hi, everyone. Those presentations were so amazing. Thank you so much. I wanted to just talk a little bit about what's happening in the workplace right now, or what's not happening in the workplace, I suppose, for most of us. You know, there are a lot of structural weaknesses in the American system of employment law. So one of them, obviously, is that healthcare is provided by employers, and that where people, when they lose their jobs, they also lose employer-connected health insurance. Another problem is that, well, I mean, I would call it a problem, is that almost everyone is employed at will. And that means they can be terminated basically anytime without any notice. And so what we saw during the 2008 financial crisis was that companies started hoarding cash because they really needed cash to operate. And the biggest way to hoard cash when you don't have access to it in the financial markets is to just cut people off the payroll. And it's administratively easier to do that in a non-unionized setting than other ways of saving money. And so, you know, that creates, you know, a sort of vicious cycle of unemployment that's really hard to fix, and jobs are really slow to come back after you've laid people off. You know, some of the other things, some of the other structural weaknesses in the American system is that there's not really any right to leave. So there's no federal right to sick leave. A lot of states have enacted sick leave laws, but they've been not even close to inadequate for this sort of situation. So you would maybe, if you were lucky, you would earn 2 weeks of sick leave. I mean, that's not going to get you through. I mean, that's long gone, right? So that was another problem. And so what Congress has tried to do is try to shore up some of these structural weaknesses in the various legislation that we've seen in a very patchwork kind of way. So the first thing Congress did was they passed this federal sick leave law. And the federal sick leave law gives you 2 weeks of sick leave. But the more important thing that the law did was it gives you 12 weeks of leave if your child's school is closed. And, you know, as we've learned, like most of the American children are not in school right now, and parents really need that leave. So what it does is it provides partial pay during that 12-week period. And that partial pay is funded by the government. So what happens is the federal government pays your wages through a payroll tax credit to your employer. So, I mean, this has been a theme throughout the pandemic, is that the federal government is underwriting a lot of the wages of people who are still on the payroll now, and in a sort of emergency bid to prevent employers from just shedding workers because because they need the cash and the operating expense is too much for them to bear if they have no revenue coming in. There were a lot of weaknesses and holes in that first piece of legislation from Congress. In particular, over the course of negotiations over the law, workers who are working for companies with more than 500 employees, so big companies, are not covered by that sick leave law. But that's about half of American workers. So about half of American workers had no access to any of these government-provided wage subsidies. So what you saw in the second stimulus bill, that was the Federal CARES Act, was essentially like gap filling of that hole through unemployment insurance. So what they did was the federal government said, we're going to fund, they anticipated correctly that the states were going to run out of money for their unemployment insurance rolls. So they massively funded state unemployment insurance. And that acted also as partly a stimulus, because when you pay people their unemployment insurance, those people will go out and spend the money because they need basic necessities. And so that's a basic stimulus. So what they did was they backstopped the states. They also made unemployment insurance longer, so up to 39 weeks. And they provided additional benefits, so an additional $600 a week for folks who are on unemployment insurance. And so what you then saw employers do was they essentially started firing their workers so they could use those additional unemployment benefits. A lot of what employers are doing as well is furloughing workers. So a furlough is when you're not fired, you still have your job, and you expect to return at some future date, which they may or may not know. But under this federal stimulus law, workers can obtain unemployment insurance during that period. And then the last thing they did in the CARES Act was they also made unemployment insurance available to gig workers. And previously, gig workers did not have access to any kind of unemployment insurance because they were not considered employees. So those workers now finally are able to access unemployment insurance benefits. Even that, of course, was not sufficient to stem the flow of unemployment, which, has progressed at a historically, unprecedented rate. So the final stimulus so far was essentially this thing called the Payroll Protection Program. And that's a program where the government underwrites wages directly. And they just said, we'll give you a loan, but the loan will be forgiven if you retain your workers for an additional 8 weeks. And so the first round of that came out in such a way that the 8 weeks will expire probably mid-June. But there was another round of that additional payroll protection program, so those will expire later. But one thing that we're going to see as we go through the summer and as the pandemic drags on is that all the stimulus we've already seen is going to start to run out. So if schools are closed in the fall, what are parents going to do? There's no leave available to them. Unemployment insurance benefits will continue, but the payroll protection program, that's an 8-week subsidy. So after that 8 weeks expires, you're back in the same position. So, I think part of what you're seeing with the push to reopen the economy is that the stimulus is starting to burn away. And if there isn't a willingness at the federal level to re-up what already was a pretty unprecedented stimulus, all of these folks who are receiving support will no longer be receiving support. And also we have a lot of problems reopening the economy. And in particular, one problem I'm concerned about is the health and safety, because these issues about protecting the workplace are so complex and what you have to do to protect workers. And essentially it forces every employer into the situation of being an expert on how to keep their workers safe. And this is something that, even experts are struggling with and updating on a day-to-day basis. And essentially companies are in the same position now of having to educate themselves. And when they reopen, if they decide to reopen, doing so in a way that provides adequate safety, both for their workers and for their customers. And I think that's going to be extremely challenging going forward. And the legal infrastructure also is kind of ambivalent when you're talking about health and safety. Most of what we have, other than sick leave laws, are workers' compensation. And workers' compensation is kind of good because it provides essentially strict liability, meaning if you get injured at work, they don't ask if your employer was negligent. If you can just show you got injured at work or that you got COVID at work, then you get those benefits no matter what. And some states have actually passed laws saying that if you're an essential worker and you get COVID, we're going to presume that you got it at work. And so we'll provide those workers' compensation benefits to you. On the other hand, workers' compensation is pretty limited. It provides your medical costs, it provides additional some wage replacement, but it's not like what you would think of as like a very generous plaintiff's verdict. It's nothing like that. It's a compromise between litigation system and an administrative system. So I think these employment issues are going to be a continued challenge. And, I also think it's going to be really hard to address some of these bigger structural weaknesses like employer provided health care, because Congress has already spent so much money on the stimulus we've already had. There may not be much appetite for additional spending in the form of, for example, Medicare for all. So, I think we are going to see continued difficulty in the employment segment of the market for the next several months, and Congress is going to have to try and keep up with it if they can. With that, I think I'll turn it back over to the moderator for questions.
Thank you. I'm wondering, this is kind of a question for all of you. I'm wondering if the U.S. Supreme Court is considering any cases or issues regarding the pandemic right now.
I would just say not to my knowledge, but I think because these things, they accept cases far enough in advance that they had accepted the current cases before we were in a pandemic. But as a sign of our times, they did, for the first time in history, just do oral arguments over the telephone, mm-hmm. which is pretty remarkable.
Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering what you feel the most surprising response to the pandemic has been, either from the legislators or the judiciary. Is there anything that stands out to you?
Seeing the complexity or the fighting between realizing the powers that exist even within the state. So if a governor issues an executive order, can the mayors either make that more stringent or loosen those? And so that's something that we haven't seen, especially with natural disasters. Normally, when the executive orders come out, they're at least 30 days in length. And then even if they dispute it, there's kind of a one command voice type of thing. So this inherent, I guess, infighting within state government is something that I'm really surprised to see.
I guess I was surprised to see how nimble Congress has been. I mean, they're not necessarily known for being nimble, but they got those stimulus plans out, just in time. Like that federal sick leave law, they had the foresight to realize that they would need to do something for school closures, and that was really critical. And they got that out kind of early. So I think none of what they did was perfect, but I do appreciate their nimbleness.
Thank you. And Greg, I see there's a question in the chat for you regarding how politics is shaped by, there's an election coming up, there's unemployment in the coal states. How is that going to shape the political response and our ability to move forward with some of these environmental issues?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think that the fact that the question hinges on coal state employment is really an interesting residue of a conversation that we've been having for a number of years. I think if you were to ask people which industry is most sort of beleaguered or suffering in the employment sector, probably coal would be right up there. Coal has fewer than 50,000 employees in the country. And you compare that to estimates about the renewable energy the clean energy sector writ large. So people who they install PVs, they do energy efficiency. You're talking about like 500,000 people, I think, in that category. If you just look at fitness instructors, I think it's 357,000 people in the United States work as fitness instructors. So my point in making that point is that the challenges that Liz has described and that all of us are aware of goes far beyond the coal sector, and in some ways, and this is not an argument to disregard those communities, because I think it's on all of us to try to make everyone come out of this as best as we can. But I do think that that as we think about addressing climate change, there's going to be opportunities perhaps to look at the broader opportunities and say, how do we grow jobs in ways that really do contribute to this monumental challenge that we're facing?
Thank you. And Liz, I was wondering, you may not have the answer to this, but I've seen some headlines around how Congress is trying to pass employer protections. So I'm not exactly sure, but it seems that it makes it harder for you to sue your employer if you contract COVID at work. Do you have any comments about that?
So I think the real issue here is we don't know what the details are for how they would plan to do that. Because the truth of the matter is almost all work-related injuries, of which I would say COVID would be considered one if you get it at work, is covered by workers' compensation. And workers' compensation is very contained. Like, how much it's going to cost. This is not like a runaway jury verdict situation. And I think for the most part, employers are okay with the status quo. And so I think what they're trying to address is maybe the rare case where you could sue. Like, for example, gig workers are not employees, so they're not covered by workers' comp. So they could actually sue in court, and companies might be on the hook for a lot of money in that situation. So I think, if all they're trying to do is shut down those small pockets of cases, I mean, maybe what you would do is you would bring them into the fold and say, well, you're eligible for workers' comp. I don't think the end result of this is going to be like to cancel workers' comp, to cancel any benefit from this. I don't think that's going to be the outcome. So I think the rhetoric is maybe more heated than the actual nuts and bolts of how that would work.
Thank you. And I see we only have a couple minutes left, but I am going to ask a question that might not be entirely fair, but if you had a crystal ball and you could see, 1 year into the future, 5 years into the future, how is the law going to look different as a result of this pandemic? Like I said, it's maybe not a fair question. You can definitely give it a pass if you want. Everyone's giving it a pass? That's okay.
I mean, in my area of expertise, this is the major controversy, right? About what do we do going on? Is this going to be all about, will the Treasury Department refinance all these debts that the oil industry is facing and hopefully buy them additional time and an opportunity to become financially more stable? Or is there an opportunity to capitalize on the investments that we've made in previous years and really move towards clean energy? And I think that's going to be a huge conversation.
As far as disaster law, I think you're going to see what you saw after Hurricane Katrina, especially because we've seen the ability. So who's responsible for reserves, the definition of an emergency, all of those things that are being challenged now under the Stafford Act are going to need clarification and definition. And so I think that similar to post-Katrina, you're going to see this type of Reformation Act in regards to the Stafford Act and exactly what FEMA is responsible for.
Thank you.
I do think that we may see, we have to do right by our essential workers. I don't think it's going to be acceptable to say things like people don't deserve sick leave or the minimum wage is okay the way it is. I mean, I do think that it will become impossible to argue that for these frontline workers that they don't deserve more.
Well, thank you so much to everybody who joined us, and especially to our panel for taking the time to talk to us about these interesting issues. I really appreciate you joining us tonight, and have a good night.